Antonella was a beautiful girl who had recently turned 14. Strong and independent, she lived with her elderly grandma after losing her parents in a car accident at a very young age. Her grandma, having raised 3 daughters, took her in and raised her as best as she could. Despite the trauma of losing her parents, Antonella adjusted well. She was always a quiet, polite, and conscientious child, growing into a friendly and beautiful young woman with a good heart. The area where Antonella lived was peaceful, with friendly neighbors and a close-knit community. The city was surrounded by lush forests, giving it a natural charm. However, the residents of Cosenza avoided the forest due to the presence of wild, dangerous animals. Stories of people venturing into the forest and never returning were common, and all the children, including Antonella, were warned never to enter. Despite the warnings, Antonella was fascinated by the forest. She loved watching the wildlife and often spent time in a treehouse her uncle built at the edge of the city, offering a fantastic view into the trees. Her grandma frequently warned her about the dangers of the forest, always worrying that Antonella might wander too far. But Antonella was sensible and obeyed her grandma. One day, on her way back from school, Antonella decided to walk down a path that skirted the city's edge where it met the forest. It was a quiet and rarely used path, but Antonella enjoyed the solitude and watching the squirrels play in the trees. Suddenly, a loud and blood-curdling howl came from the forest. Instinctively, she knew it was a wolf, and she ran towards home. But something stopped her, a curiosity or interest. The howl didn't sound scary. It sounded like an animal in pain or danger. She cautiously stepped into the forest and soon saw an animal lying in a clearing ahead. As she approached, she realized it was a wolf, and her blood ran cold. Wolves were dangerous, but she saw wolf pups gathered around their injured mother. The mother wolf had clearly been in a fight, with wounds from defending her children. Slowly, the mother stopped breathing, leaving the pups alone and scared. Antonella approached cautiously, but the pups didn't seem scared. She reached into her bag, pulled out some food, and threw it to the pups, who eagerly ate. As they ate, Antonella laid her hand on the dead wolf's head and silently vowed to protect her cubs, promising to bring them food as often as she could. She couldn't take them home, as they belonged in the wild, and her grandma would know she disobeyed orders. Worried the cubs wouldn't survive without their mother, Antonella devised a plan. She would take them to her treehouse and care for them there. Antonella knew the wolf cubs would be safe in the treehouse, and she could easily care for them there. She even gave them names, Romulus and Remus. Every day after school, she would visit them, bringing food and playing with them all evening. The cubs were happy, energetic, and seemed to love her company. This routine continued for months as Antonella watched the cubs grow stronger and bigger. Contrary to what she had always been led to believe, the wolves were friendly and sociable. They enjoyed Antonella's company and even started to act more like dogs than wolves. Their tails would wag when they saw her coming, and they would yap and roll around on the floor after she fed them their favorite meals. It truly was a partnership made in heaven. One day, as Antonella walked to the treehouse, she noticed some men following her. She quickened her pace, and the men started to run, prompting Antonella to sprint. Just before she reached her treehouse, the men caught up with her. They threatened her with a knife and dragged her into the forest to enact their evil plan. The men led her deep into the trees, where they threw her on the ground. Antonella, on her knees before them, was scared to death. Tears filled her eyes as she wondered if she would ever see her grandma and her home again. Before the men could do anything, a distant howl rang through the forest. It stopped them in their tracks, and they looked at each other, suddenly wary and panicked. Antonella, on the other hand, felt a spark of hope. She recognized those howls. The men waited for several moments, but there was no further sound. They turned their attention back to Antonella with an evil look in their eyes. Suddenly, there was a loud rustling, and out of the foliage pounced Romulus and Remus. They positioned themselves between Antonella and her attackers, baring their teeth, growling, and swiping their paws at the men. The two wolves had seen Antonella being snatched from the treehouse window. They had broken out of their home, tracked their beloved friend and her captors into the forest, and leaped into action to defend her. Antonella had never felt safer than she did at that moment. The attackers, on the other hand, were terrified. They fled in different directions, with the wolves playfully chasing after them, snapping at their heels and snarling as they ran. The men would never think of committing such a horrible act again, nor would they dare approach the forest in fear of being attacked by the wolves once more. The wolves then returned to Antonella, who was shaken and upset but otherwise okay. They nuzzled her and sat against her, and in her lap, until she felt strong enough to pick herself up and walk back home. All the while, Romulus and Remus remained at her side, guarding her, protecting her, and looking out for her just as she had done for them. As Antonella and her loyal wolves walked back to the treehouse, she thought about how much her life had changed since meeting them. These wolves were not just animals she cared for. They had become her family. She knew her grandma would worry if she stayed out too long, but she also knew that explaining the bond she had formed with Romulus and Remus might make her grandma understand. Back at the treehouse, Antonella fed the wolves and played with them until the sun began to set. She told them about her day and how thankful she was for their protection. The wolves seemed to listen intently, their eyes shining with understanding and loyalty. As dusk fell, Antonella reluctantly left them, promising to return the next day. Over the following weeks, Antonella noticed a change in the way the townspeople treated her. Word of her bravery and the bond she shared with the wolves had spread, and people began to see her as a protector of the forest. They no longer feared the wolves, understanding that the animals were not vicious creatures but loyal companions who had saved one of their own. One evening, Antonella's grandma called her into the living room. She had heard the stories too and was worried for her granddaughter's safety. Antonella explained everything, from finding the wolf cubs to the day they saved her life. She spoke about the bond she had formed with Romulus and Remus and how they had become her family in the forest. Her grandma listened carefully, her eyes filling with tears of both fear and pride. She hugged Antonella tightly and said, "I am proud of you for your bravery and your kindness, but you must be careful. The forest is still a dangerous place, and I don't want to lose you two." Antonella promised to be careful and reassured her grandma that Romulus and Remus would always be there to protect her. From that day on, her grandma allowed her to visit the wolves, understanding that they were an essential part of her granddaughter's life. As the years passed, Antonella continued to care for Romulus and Remus. They grew into strong, majestic wolves, always by her side, protecting her and watching over her. The bond they shared was unbreakable, a testament to the power of love and loyalty between humans and animals. The story of Antonella and her wolves became a legend in the small community of Top of the World. It was a story of bravery, kindness, and the extraordinary bond that can form between a girl and her wolves. And every time Antonella looked into the eyes of Romulus and Remus, she knew she was never alone.